Edward Harper was convinced that the Robinson family didn't belong in his high-end residential building. His sense of superiority fueled a campaign to have them removed, but he had no clue the Robinsons were, in fact, the true owners of the property. What followed would leave him utterly dumbfounded. The Robinsons, a family of four, were thrilled to move into their new home, a grand and historic building situated in the heart of the city. Richard Robinson, a self-made entrepreneur, his wife Clara, and their two children, Emily and Leo, had worked hard to achieve their dreams. But what made this move unique was their decision to live under the guise of tenants instead of openly declaring their ownership of the property. Richard found the idea amusing, though he had an inkling it might complicate things. Their arrival in a sleek, silver SUV caught the watchful eye of Edward Harper, the building's long-serving property manager. Edward, a man in his late 60s with a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of entitlement, prided himself on maintaining the building's exclusivity. As the Robinsons stepped out, he couldn't hide his disdain, his lips curling in a frown. "Who are they?" he muttered to himself, clutching his clipboard as if it were a shield against unwanted newcomers. Later that afternoon, as Richard was unpacking boxes, Edward approached with a calculated smile. "Good afternoon," Edward began, his voice dripping with politeness. "I couldn't help but notice you're moving in. Are you sure this is the right address?" Richard raised an eyebrow, sensing the underlying tone. "Yes, this is the place," he replied smoothly. "We got everything sorted." Edward's smile tightened. "Ah, I see. You know, this building has a certain reputation. Its residents are accustomed to a particular way of life. I hope you're prepared for that." Richard chuckled lightly, keeping his cool. "We're very aware of the expectations, Mr. Harper." "Edward Harper," he replied curtly. "Well, I trust there won't be any issues." In the days that followed, Edward began his campaign of subtle sabotage. Under the guise of routine inspections, he frequently dropped by the Robinsons' apartment. On one occasion, he claimed there was a noise complaint from a neighbor. Another time, he cited improperly sorted recycling. Each time, Richard calmly addressed the matter, but Edward's irritation grew as he failed to provoke the response he sought. One morning, Edward rang their doorbell with an official-looking notice. "I'll need access to your unit for a mandatory safety inspection," he declared. Clara greeted him at the door, her polite smile masking her growing frustration. "Of course, come in," she said, stepping aside. Edward entered, clipboard in hand, his eyes scanning the apartment like a hawk. He walked through the rooms, making notes and muttering to himself. Dust on the baseboards, faint scuffs on the floor. "Not quite up to standard," he said, loud enough for Clara to hear. Clara finally lost her composure. "Mr. Harper," she said sharply, "you've inspected this place more thoroughly than any health and safety officer ever would. It's starting to feel like harassment." Edward looked taken aback, but quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "I'm simply ensuring the building remains in top condition." "Well," Clara shot back, "we've complied with every rule and will continue to do so. If you have nothing else, please leave." Undeterred, Edward turned his attention to the other residents. He began distributing anonymous letters, warning of potential disturbances caused by unvetted tenants. He encouraged the neighbors to report any unusual behavior, further stoking suspicion. Richard noticed the change immediately. Where once people exchanged friendly nods in the hallway, now the Robinsons were met with cold stares or avoided altogether. Even Emily and Leo sensed the tension. "Dad, why don't the neighbors say hi to us?" Leo asked one evening. Richard clenched his jaw, vowing to protect his family from the hostility brewing around them. The breaking point came a week later. Edward confronted Richard at the building's entrance, his tone dripping with false civility. "Mr. Robinson, I trust you understand the importance of maintaining harmony in this community." "I understand perfectly," Richard replied, his voice calm but firm. "And I assure you, my family and I have done nothing to disturb that harmony." Edward's mask of politeness slipped, and he sneered. "Let's be honest, this isn't the kind of place for just anyone. Standards must be upheld." Richard stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "Mr. Harper, I suggest you choose your next words carefully. You might not like where this conversation ends." Edward faltered, caught off guard by the unshakable confidence in Richard's tone. The truth was revealed not long after when Richard decided it was time to end the charade. During a tense building-wide meeting that Edward had called to discuss community concerns, Richard stood and addressed the room. "My name is Richard Robinson," he announced, his voice commanding attention. "And as of 6 months ago, my family became the rightful owners of this building." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Edward, whose face paled. "So, Mr. Harper," Richard continued, "I suggest you start treating my family with the respect we deserve, or I'll be forced to reconsider your position as manager." Edward stammered, but no words came. The residents, shocked by the revelation, began murmuring among themselves, many now embarrassed by their earlier behavior. Richard's steady gaze didn't waver, and for the first time, Edward Harper felt truly powerless. The situation escalated when Edward Harper, the building manager, appeared at the Robinsons' door with a document in hand, his expression smug and confrontational. "Your children are too noisy," he declared, waving the paper. "I've received complaints from other residents. I'll have to take action. This isn't the kind of place for disruptive families." Richard Robinson, barely containing his anger, responded sharply. "That's completely untrue, and you know it. We've followed every rule. You have no legitimate grounds for this." Edward smirked, clearly relishing the confrontation. "Maybe not yet," he said, his voice tinged with malice. "But if things continue like this, it won't be long." Richard saw through Edward's intentions. He knew this wasn't about rules or noise. It was about Edward's deep-seated prejudice. Deciding not to reveal his hand yet, Richard kept calm, determined to let Edward's own actions expose him. Determined to escalate matters, Edward filed a report with local authorities, accusing the Robinson family of causing disturbances in the building. When officers arrived to investigate, Richard greeted them courteously. He invited them into the apartment, showing complete transparency and compliance with every regulation. After a brief inspection and a discussion with the family, the officers left without finding any violations. Edward's complaint was deemed baseless. But Edward wasn't done. At the next residents' meeting, he openly denounced the Robinsons, using thinly veiled language to disguise his prejudice. "This building has always upheld high standards," Edward announced, scanning the room as if daring anyone to disagree. "And we all understand that certain individuals might not be the right fit for this community." His gaze lingered on Richard as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Most residents stayed silent, but a few exchanged uneasy glances. Then, unexpectedly, a young resident named Peter stood up. "Maybe the real issue here is your behavior, Mr. Harper," Peter said firmly. "It seems to me that you're the one making people uncomfortable." Edward flushed, but tried to recover. "This isn't up for debate," he snapped. "We maintain traditions here. Anyone who doesn't like them can leave." The next day, Richard decided it was time to act. He contacted his lawyer to prepare for legal proceedings but kept his plans quiet. The unexpected twist came when a fellow resident, disturbed by Edward's discriminatory remarks, recorded the meeting and uploaded the footage online. The video quickly went viral, sparking widespread outrage. Viewers condemned Edward's behavior, and the story made headlines across the city. Faced with mounting public pressure, the building's board of directors convened an emergency meeting to address the controversy. During this session, Richard revealed the truth about his family's position. He presented documents proving that the Robinsons were not tenants, but the majority owners of the property, a fact Edward had been blissfully unaware of. "Mr. Harper," Richard said calmly, his voice firm but measured, "your conduct has been unacceptable. Not only have you mistreated my family, but you've also jeopardized the reputation of this building. I am now formally requesting your dismissal." Edward's face drained of color as the weight of his mistake sank in. The room erupted in whispers, and the board members exchanged knowing looks. Edward had not only antagonized the wrong family, but had also brought public disgrace to the building. That evening, Edward requested a private meeting with Richard. In an empty conference room, the once arrogant manager now looked defeated. "Mr. Robinson," Edward began, his voice shaky. I realize I made mistakes, but you have to understand, I was only trying to protect the building's standards. I never meant to cause harm. Richard studied him, his expression unreadable. This wasn't an accident, Edward, he said after a pause. You made deliberate choices based on prejudice. That's something you need to own up to. Edward hesitated before stammering. I'm willing to change. I need a chance. Richard considered him for a moment, then nodded. You'll get a chance, but not in the way you're expecting. I'll recommend that the board suspend your dismissal, on the condition that you complete a cultural awareness program and a social justice training course. Edward's mouth fell open in surprise. He hadn't anticipated this, but realizing it was his only option, he reluctantly agreed. Over the next several months, Edward participated in the programs. He attended workshops, engaged in conversations with people from diverse backgrounds, and began to reflect on his own biases. Slowly, his hardened demeanor softened, and he started to understand the damage his actions had caused. Meanwhile, the Robinsons became an integral part of the community. Neighbors who had initially distanced themselves began apologizing, and friendships blossomed. Clara organized a community event to encourage dialogue among residents, and the building transformed into a more inclusive and welcoming environment. At the next residents' meeting, Edward stood before the crowd, a humble man. I owe an apology to Mr. Robinson and his family, he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. I acted out of ignorance and arrogance, and I caused harm. I was wrong to judge anyone's worthiness to live here. I'm grateful for the chance to change. Richard nodded, accepting the apology. The room erupted into applause, signaling not just forgiveness, but also a collective commitment to a better future. The Robinsons had not only won the battle for their rights, but had also inspired a profound transformation in their community and in Edward Harper himself. As Edward Harper concluded his heartfelt apology, the room filled with applause. For the first time, the Robinsons truly felt the warmth of the community they had longed to be part of. What began as a battle against prejudice had evolved into something much greater, a powerful example of resilience, reconciliation, and transformation. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the building changed drastically. Neighbors who had once avoided the Robinsons began to reach out, introducing themselves and even inviting the family to casual gatherings. Children in the building, once hesitant to play with Emily and Leo, now knocked on their door eagerly, asking to join them in the courtyard. Clara started organizing monthly potluck dinners, which became a tradition that united residents who had previously kept to themselves. Edward, now humbled and eager to learn, made a concerted effort to engage with the community. He attended events, helped residents with their concerns without bias, and frequently sought advice from Richard and Clara on how to foster a more inclusive environment. Though he still had a long way to go, his determination to change became evident to everyone around him. The once feared and arrogant building manager was now a man seeking redemption, and his sincerity began to win over even his harshest critics. Meanwhile, Richard's quiet leadership resonated beyond the confines of the building. The viral video and the Robinson story had sparked conversations about discrimination and privilege in housing communities across the city. Richard was invited to speak at local forums, sharing how his family's experience highlighted the importance of challenging stereotypes and advocating for fairness. His eloquence and composure earned him respect, and he became a sought-after voice for change. Through their trials, the Robinsons discovered that standing firm in the face of adversity not only safeguarded their rights, but also inspired others to reflect on their own biases. Their decision to confront the issue head-on, with patience and dignity, left an indelible mark on the community. They had shown that change was possible, not by shouting down opponents, but by holding a mirror to their behavior and offering a path to redemption. By the end of the year, the building had transformed into a beacon of harmony and progress. Residents celebrated the holidays together, decorating the common spaces and hosting events that showcased their diverse backgrounds. The Robinsons, once seen as outsiders, became the heart of the community. Their ability to navigate hardship with grace taught everyone a valuable lesson. Unity could only be achieved through understanding, and understanding required courage. Edward Harper, now an active ally, continued his journey of self-improvement. He publicly credited the Robinsons for giving him the chance to learn and grow. In private, he often reflected on the profound impact they had on his life, vowing never to let prejudice cloud his judgment again. As the Robinsons sat on their balcony one quiet evening, watching the city lights twinkle, Richard turned to Clara with a smile. "We didn't just find a home here," he said. "We helped make one, for everyone." And in that moment, surrounded by love, acceptance, and the promise of a brighter future, they knew their journey had been worth every challenge. The Robinsons had not only redefined their community, but had also left a legacy of resilience, compassion, and lasting change.